10 horrifying hammer homicides. Welcome to Creepshow, where we explore the darkest corners of human nature and the chilling stories that linger in the shadows. Few weapons evoke the raw, savage brutality of a hammer, an everyday tool turned into a deadly instrument of terror. Tonight, we delve into 10 horrifying hammer homicides, stories of shocking violence where ordinary objects were used to unleash extraordinary horrors. Prepare yourself as we unravel these chilling tales of rage, betrayal, and bloodshed. Number 10. Tough Negotiator. It was a cold November night in 2016 when two pizza delivery men in Baldwin, New York, stumbled upon a horrifying discovery. Behind an unassuming apartment building, hidden among the weeds, lay the battered body of 25-year-old Diana Wingender. Her face and skull bore the unmistakable marks of a violent attack, and blood had pooled around her lifeless form. The weapon? A hammer? The investigation led detectives to Rafael Oyag, the tenant of a nearby apartment. At 36 years old, Oyag already had a criminal record, with prior arrests for assault, DWI, and violating protective orders. But nothing in his past could prepare investigators for what they were about to uncover. Wingender, a Craigslist escort, had arranged to meet Oyag at his apartment that night. Their plan seemed straightforward, an exchange of money for services, but things quickly spiraled out of control. According to prosecutors, an argument broke out between the two, allegedly over the payment for her services. What should have been a simple transaction turned violent when Oyag, in a fit of rage, grabbed a hammer and struck Wingender repeatedly. The blows were brutal and unrelenting, leaving her with devastating injuries that ended her life within moments. But the horror didn't stop there. After the murder, Oyag attempted to conceal the crime. He dragged Wingender's body down a flight of stairs and out the back of his building, leaving a bloody trail that would later lead investigators straight to him. He dumped her in the weeds behind the property, hoping the secluded spot would keep her body hidden. By morning, Oyag's plan had fallen apart. The delivery men, noticing something unusual as they passed by, stumbled upon Wingender's remains and alerted authorities. A closer inspection of the scene revealed the trail of blood leading directly to Oyag's apartment. Detectives quickly pieced together the evidence. Phone records showed correspondence between Oyag and Wingender, and surveillance footage confirmed she had arrived at his apartment that night in a hired car. The evidence was damning. Oyag was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Despite the overwhelming evidence, he pleaded not guilty and was held without bail. The case painted a grim picture of a man whose past violence and disregard for the law culminated in a horrifying act of brutality. For Diana Wingender, a young woman whose life ended so tragically, the details of her final moments left a haunting reminder of how quickly a situation can turn deadly. The case shocked the Baldwin community, serving as a chilling testament to the primal violence a simple tool like a hammer can unleash in the hands of a killer. Number 9. Clandestine Corpse. It was a discovery that stunned the quiet neighborhood of Lomita, California. In the summer of 2015, police uncovered the mummified remains of Raven Joy Campbell, hidden behind a wall in a unit of the Harbor Hills housing project. The gruesome find revealed a dark secret that had been buried, quite literally, for 6 years. Raven Joy Campbell was a 37-year-old woman described by her family as warm, kind, and deeply connected to those she loved. She had her quirks, one of which was her attachment to her purse, which she carried everywhere, often clutched tightly to her chest. For her family, this detail became a chilling clue when Raven suddenly disappeared in 2009, and her purse was found abandoned inside the apartment she shared with her boyfriend, Randolph Garbutt. Her family knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. Raven would never willingly part with her purse. They reported her missing, but the investigation yielded no solid leads. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years, and still, there was no trace of Raven. Meanwhile, the apartment where Raven had lived became the center of growing unease. Neighbors began complaining about a persistent foul odor emanating from the unit. For years, the smell lingered, but no one connected it to Raven's disappearance. In 2015, 6 years after Raven was last seen, her sister contacted the police again. She had a hunch, an unshakable feeling that the answers lay within the apartment. This time, authorities brought in corpse-sniffing dogs, determined to leave no stone unturned. The search led them to a chilling discovery. Behind a wall inside the apartment, police found Raven's body, hidden in a hollow space. The autopsy revealed she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, inflicted by a hammer. The walls of her former home had silently concealed her fate for years. The gruesome truth pointed directly to Randolph Garbutt, Raven's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. Garbutt, 43, had continued to live his life as if nothing had happened, all while Raven's remains lay hidden just feet away. Authorities allege that Garbutt killed Raven in a violent rage, using a hammer to strike her in the head. After the murder, he concealed her body in the wall, hoping to hide his crime indefinitely. For Raven's family, the discovery was devastating, yet brought a small measure of closure. They had spent 6 years searching for answers, haunted by the mystery of her disappearance. Now they knew the terrible truth. Garbutt was arrested and charged with murder. If convicted, he faces life in prison for his heinous crime. The case shocked the community, a grim reminder of how darkness can lurk behind seemingly ordinary walls. For 6 long years, Raven's family fought to uncover the truth. The discovery of her body revealed not just a murder, but a harrowing tale of concealment and silence. Her story serves as a haunting testament to the resilience of those who seek justice, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Number 8. Brutalized Bosnian. In the early hours of November 30, 2014, the streets of St. Louis, Missouri witnessed an act of senseless violence that shocked both the local community and the nation. Zamir Begic, a 32-year-old Bosnian immigrant, was on his way home after a night out with friends. He had no idea that his life would come to a brutal and tragic end at the hands of 4 teenagers armed with hammers. Zamir had come to the United States from war-torn Bosnia in search of a better life. Like many Bosnian immigrants in St. Louis, he sought refuge from the horrors of conflict and hoped to build a future filled with peace and opportunity. Known as a hard-working and kind man, Zamir had settled into the close-knit Bosnian community that thrived in the city. On that fateful night, Zamir was driving home when he encountered a group of teens vandalizing cars in the street. Among them were Travis Kidd, Robert Mitchell, Juan Carlos Fabian Lutz, and Darian Johnner, all aged between 16 and 17. As Zamir pulled over and stepped out of his car to confront them, the situation escalated into a deadly attack. According to witnesses, Travis Kidd climbed onto the back of Zamir's car and struck him in the head with a hammer. Staggering from the blow, Zamir tried to defend himself, but the other teens joined in, surrounding him. They beat him repeatedly with hammers in a frenzied assault, leaving him crumpled and bleeding on the pavement. The attack was so savage that Zamir succumbed to his injuries shortly after being rushed to the hospital. The crime stunned St. Louis, but the shockwaves extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. Many members of the Bosnian community saw the attack as a hate crime. The teens involved were Black and Hispanic, and the attack occurred during a tense time in the city's history. Just 1 week earlier, a grand jury had decided not to indict a white police officer in the shooting of a Black teenager, Michael Brown, in nearby Ferguson, Missouri. The decision had sparked widespread protests and unrest, leaving racial tensions running high in the region. Although authorities did not classify Zamir's murder as a hate crime, the Bosnian community strongly believed that it was motivated by racial animosity. The randomness and ferocity of the attack, combined with the ethnic makeup of the perpetrators and the victim, fueled their fears. Protests erupted in St. Louis, with many demanding justice for Zamir and greater recognition of the violence faced by immigrant communities. The teenagers responsible for Zamir's death were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. As the case unfolded, it revealed chilling details about the attacker's mindset. Prosecutors argued that the teens had no remorse for their actions and had targeted Zamir without provocation. Witness testimony painted a picture of a group emboldened by mob mentality, acting without regard for the value of human life. Zamir's death left a lasting scar on the Bosnian community in St. Louis. For many, it was a painful reminder of the violence they had fled in their home country, now finding it again in a place where they had sought safety. His family and friends mourned the loss of a kind and hard-working man whose life had been cut short by senseless brutality. The story of Zamir Begic is not just one of a tragic murder. It is also a reflection of the deeper divides in society, racial tensions, the struggles of immigrant communities, and the consequences of unchecked violence. His death remains a haunting reminder of how quickly a single act of hate and aggression can shatter lives. Number 7. Utah Rampage. It was a calm October evening in West Valley City, Utah, when the quiet streets were shattered by an act of terrifying violence. Leslie Buse, a 68-year-old man known for his gentle demeanor, stepped outside his home, unaware that he was about to encounter a stranger whose mind had been consumed by delusions. What followed was a gruesome and senseless attack, leaving a peaceful neighborhood reeling in shock. Gerardo Perez, just 20 years old, was wandering the streets that night. Witnesses later described his behavior as bizarre and otherworldly, saying he moved like a zombie. He mumbled to himself, his face vacant but his movements erratic, as though his mind was controlled by something dark and incomprehensible. Perez, suffering from severe delusions linked to untreated mental illness, was armed with two deadly tools, a hammer and a large knife. Leslie Buse, a retiree who had lived in the neighborhood for years, had no reason to suspect danger as he stepped outside. Perez spotted him and began to approach. Witnesses would later recount how Perez moved toward Buse with a chilling, unnatural focus, as if he were drawn to him. Without warning, Perez swung the hammer, delivering a brutal blow to Buse's head. The older man staggered, trying to retreat toward the safety of his home, but Perez didn't stop. He struck again and again, the hammer smashing into Buse's skull with relentless force. Blood splattered the sidewalk as Buse collapsed onto his porch. Even as his victim lay helpless, Perez didn't relent. He switched to the large knife, slashing wildly at the man. Buse, mortally wounded, managed to crawl back into his home, leaving a trail of blood behind him. It was a desperate attempt to escape, but the damage was already done. Neighbors, horrified by the sounds of the attack, called 911. Police arrived quickly and found Perez still near the scene. He resisted arrest, his erratic behavior making it clear that he was deeply unwell. Officers subdued him, but the horror of what he had done was evident in the bloody trail leading to Buse's front door. Leslie Buse was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. His injuries were catastrophic, multiple skull fractures and deep knife wounds. For 4 agonizing weeks, he clung to life on a ventilator. His family and friends hoped for a miracle, but the damage was too severe. Buse succumbed to his injuries, leaving behind a grieving community and a family devastated by the senseless loss. Gerardo Perez was charged with aggravated murder, among other crimes, including obstruction of justice, aggravated assault, and resisting arrest. As part of a plea deal, the additional charges were dropped, and Perez admitted to the murder. Prosecutors acknowledged his severe mental illness, but argued that the brutality of the attack demanded justice. The case highlighted the dangerous intersection of untreated mental illness and violence. Perez's delusions, left unchecked, had transformed an ordinary evening into a nightmare. For the residents of West Valley City, the image of Buse's bloodied front porch became a haunting reminder of how fragile the sense of safety can be. Leslie Buse was remembered as a kind and caring man, a retiree who had worked hard to build a life of peace in his later years. His murder was a senseless act, one that left scars not just on his family, but on an entire community. Gerardo Perez's story is equally tragic. A young man whose mind was consumed by illness, his actions driven by forces he couldn't control. But for Buse and his loved ones, those explanations could never bring back what was lost. Number 6. Dismembered X. The small coastal town of Montrose, Scotland, was forever scarred in 2015 when pieces of a horrifying puzzle began to surface. Literally. Kimberly Mackenzie, 37, had vanished, but the clues to her fate came in the form of her dismembered remains, scattered in trash bins across the town. What unfolded was a gruesome tale of betrayal, brutality, and unimaginable cruelty. Kimberly Mackenzie's life had been far from easy. At 37, she was trying to find stability, but her relationships were tumultuous, particularly with her ex-boyfriend, Stephen Jackson. At 40 years old, Jackson was known for his volatile nature, and his relationship with Mackenzie had been toxic at best. On the fateful day of her murder, Mackenzie visited Jackson's home. Also present was Jackson's partner, Michelle Higgins, a 29-year-old woman with her own troubled history. What began as a tense encounter soon spiraled into unspeakable violence. Prosecutors would later piece together the horrific chain of events. According to witnesses, an argument broke out between the three. As the fight escalated, Higgins picked up a hammer and struck Mackenzie in the back of the head with brutal force. The blow was so violent that brain matter splattered across the room, leaving a grisly reminder of the attack's savagery. Mackenzie collapsed, but the nightmare wasn't over. Jackson, seizing control of the situation, slit her throat, ensuring she would not survive. What followed was a level of depravity that shocked even seasoned investigators. To cover up the murder, Jackson and Higgins set about dismembering Mackenzie's body. Using a saw, knives, and even a screwdriver, they methodically cut her into pieces. The grim task wasn't just about hiding evidence. It seemed almost ritualistic, an act of utter dehumanization. Over the next few days, the pair scattered Mackenzie's remains throughout Montrose. Body parts were stuffed into trash bins, while other fragments were hidden in lockers around town. The plan, however, began to unravel when Jackson's ex-wife, Barbara White, became involved. Barbara White, 43, hadn't seen Jackson in 17 years when the two crossed paths again at a bed and breakfast. During their reunion, Jackson made a chilling confession. He described how Higgins had struck Mackenzie with a hammer, how he had slit her throat, and how they had dismembered her body to dispose of the evidence. Barbara initially dismissed Jackson's confession as one of his dark jokes. He had always been fascinated by true crime stories and had a penchant for spinning macabre tales. But as Jackson continued to recount the murder in graphic detail, Barbara realized he wasn't making it up. Disturbed and horrified, Barbara contacted the authorities. Her testimony became a crucial part of the investigation, corroborating the physical evidence police were finding across Montrose. The trial revealed the extent of Jackson and Higgins' monstrous actions. Forensic experts described the sheer brutality of the murder, while prosecutors painted a damning picture of the couple's cold, calculated efforts to cover up their crime. Stephen Jackson was convicted of murder, while Michelle Higgins faced charges for her role in the killing and the dismemberment. The case shocked Scotland, not just because of the violence, but because of the ordinary setting. A quiet town suddenly thrust into the spotlight for one of the most gruesome crimes in recent memory. Number 5. Greenville Quadruple Murder. On a sweltering summer day in Greenville, North Carolina in 2016, a quiet neighborhood awoke to a nightmare that would haunt the community for years to come. Inside a modest home, police discovered a scene of unimaginable horror. The lifeless bodies of Garlette Howard, 32, and her 3 daughters, Brianna Carr, 11, Iona Toon, 7, and Mayona Toon, 6. The cause of death was a series of brutal head injuries, believed to have been inflicted with a claw hammer. Garlette Howard was a dedicated mother who worked tirelessly to provide for her daughters. Those who knew her described her as loving, hard-working, and devoted to her children. She had been married to Debon Toon, 39, the father of her 2 youngest daughters, Iona and Mayona. But behind the facade of a family home lay tensions that would erupt into devastating violence. On the morning of the murders, neighbors heard nothing out of the ordinary. There were no shouts, no screams, only a dreadful silence. It wasn't until later that day that police arrived at the home, responding to a welfare check request. Inside, they discovered the victims' bodies. The gruesome injuries on each of the 4 told a chilling story of rage and brutality. As investigators began piecing together the events leading up to the crime, all evidence pointed to Debon Toon, Garlette's husband. He was nowhere to be found, but police quickly tracked his location to Richmond, Virginia, approximately 4 hours away. Toon was driving Garlette's work-issued vehicle, a detail that gave law enforcement the edge they needed. Through OnStar technology, investigators disabled the car remotely, bringing it to a stop. Shortly after, a joint task force of U.S. Marshals and Virginia police apprehended Toon. He was taken into custody without incident, though the shadow of what he had done loomed heavily over everyone involved. Autopsy reports confirmed that Garlette and her daughters had died from traumatic head injuries consistent with being struck by a claw hammer. The crime left investigators and the Greenville community grappling with the sheer brutality of the act. Questions of motive swirled, but no explanation could justify the senseless loss of a mother and 3 young children whose futures had been stolen in an instant of rage. Friends and neighbors mourned the loss, struggling to comprehend how such violence could erupt within a seemingly ordinary family. Garlette's older daughter, Brianna, had been a bright, joyful girl who adored her younger sisters. Iona and Mayona, playful and full of life, had been inseparable, always giggling and running through the neighborhood. The tragedy left a deep scar on Greenville, where the memory of Garlette and her daughters lingers in the hearts of those who knew them. For Toon, the charges of first-degree murder meant he faced the possibility of life imprisonment without parole or even the death penalty. Number 4. Hammer Hitmen. On a quiet summer morning in June 2015, the sleepy community of Bonita Springs, Florida, was shaken by a murder so brutal and shocking that it left even seasoned investigators stunned. Dr. Teresa Sievers, a beloved physician and mother of 2, was found dead in her kitchen, her skull crushed by multiple blows from a hammer. The weapon, matted with blood and hair, lay beside her lifeless body. At first glance, the crime seemed like a burglary gone wrong. But as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a twisted web of betrayal, greed, and cold-blooded murder that would leave everyone involved reeling. Dr. Teresa Sievers was known for her warmth and dedication to her patients. She ran a holistic medical practice and was deeply involved in her community. On the surface, she appeared to have an idyllic life with her husband, Mark Sievers, and their 2 young daughters. But beneath the veneer of their seemingly happy marriage, cracks were beginning to show. Teresa had just returned home from a family reunion in Connecticut. Her husband and daughters had stayed behind, but Teresa flew back early to keep her practice running. What she didn't know was that her return was being watched and planned for. The investigation quickly revealed that Teresa's murder wasn't random. Authorities linked the crime to Curtis Wayne Wright Jr., a childhood friend of Mark Sievers. Wright, along with his younger accomplice Jimmy Rogers, had traveled from Missouri to Florida just days before the murder. According to prosecutors, the plan was orchestrated by Mark Sievers himself. Facing financial troubles and lured by the prospect of a $4.43 million life insurance policy in Teresa's name, Mark allegedly enlisted Wright to carry out the killing. Wright, in turn, brought Rogers along as muscle. The plan was chillingly precise. Wright and Rogers broke into the Sievers home and waited for Teresa to return. When she walked through the door, they ambushed her in the kitchen. Using a hammer, they struck her multiple times in the head with devastating force, ensuring her death. The case took a major turn when Curtis Wright was arrested. Facing the possibility of life in prison, Wright struck a plea deal with prosecutors. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a 25-year sentence and agreed to testify against both Mark Sievers and Jimmy Rogers. Wright's testimony painted a damning picture of Mark Sievers as the mastermind behind his wife's murder. According to Wright, Mark had not only planned the killing but had also offered advice on how to make it look like a botched burglary. Wright described Mark as cold, calculating, and entirely motivated by greed. Jimmy Rogers, known by his nickname The Hammer, was also charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that Rogers carried out the actual killing while Wright acted as his accomplice. Rogers denied the allegations, but Wright's testimony and forensic evidence tied him to the crime scene. In 2019, Mark Sievers stood trial for his wife's murder. The prosecution's case hinged on Wright's testimony, as well as evidence of the financial motive and suspicious behavior leading up to the crime. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before finding Mark Sievers guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death, a rare outcome in Florida's legal system. Jimmy Rogers was also convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers is a chilling example of how greed and betrayal can twist love into something dark and deadly. A mother, a wife, and a healer was taken from her family and community in one of the most brutal ways imaginable, all because of a husband's calculated desire for money. The echoes of that hammer and the lives shattered by its blows continue to haunt Bonita Springs to this day. Number 3. The Macias Brothers. On a warm evening in 2015, the quiet neighborhood of West Valinda, California, was rocked by a brutal murder that left residents shaken. The crime wasn't carried out by a lone killer, but by two brothers whose rage and violence ended the life of their neighbor Luis Segura in a savage attack with a hammer. What followed was a standoff that turned a small street into the site of a chilling crime scene. Luis Segura, 44, was a hard-working man and a devoted family figure, living peacefully with his wife in their modest home. But tensions with their neighbors, Jonathan Macias, 23, and Flavio Macias Jr., 28, had been simmering for some time. The brothers, particularly Flavio, were known for trouble. Flavio had a criminal history, including convictions for domestic violence, carrying a dagger, and drug possession. On the night of the murder, those tensions boiled over into a deadly confrontation. Witnesses reported seeing Segura arguing with the Macias brothers outside their homes. The argument escalated rapidly, and Flavio, consumed by rage, grabbed a hammer and attacked Segura. Flavio struck Segura multiple times, the blows landing with devastating force. As Segura collapsed, injured and bleeding, Flavio continued the assault, leaving Segura critically wounded. Meanwhile, Jonathan stood nearby, acting as a lookout to ensure no one intervened. What made the attack even more horrifying was what happened next. Segura's wife, hearing the commotion, ran outside and saw a chilling scene. The Macias brothers were trying to drag her injured husband into his own van. It seemed like they were attempting to move his body to cover up the crime or dispose of it. Terrified, she screamed for help and called 911. Her cries likely saved Segura's body from being taken away, but the damage had already been done. By the time paramedics arrived, Segura was barely clinging to life. He was rushed to a nearby hospital but succumbed to his injuries, the brutal hammer attack claiming his life. The Macias brothers fled the scene and barricaded themselves inside their home, hoping to avoid capture. When Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies arrived, they found the brothers unwilling to surrender. A tense standoff ensued as the brothers fortified their position, refusing to come out. Law enforcement officers, determined to bring them to justice, deployed tear gas to flush them out of the house. Even then, the brothers resisted. It wasn't until a police dog was sent in that they were finally subdued and arrested. During the investigation, Segura's wife gave a detailed account of what she had witnessed, confirming the brothers' roles in the murder. Flavio was identified as the one who wielded the hammer, while Jonathan acted as an accomplice. Prosecutors charged Flavio with murder, a conviction that could result in a sentence of 28 years to life. Jonathan, for his part in the crime, faced charges that carried a maximum penalty of 25 years in prison. Both brothers pleaded not guilty, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. Witness testimonies, the physical evidence at the scene, and their behavior during the standoff painted a grim picture of their guilt. The brutal killing of Luis Segura sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, leaving a deep scar on the small community. For Segura's wife, the loss was unimaginable. Not just the death of her husband, but the violent and senseless way in which his life was taken. The story of the Macias brothers is a stark reminder of how simmering conflicts can explode into unimaginable violence, turning neighbors into killers and homes into crime scenes. The hammer, an everyday tool, once again became a weapon of unspeakable destruction in the hands of those driven by rage. Number 2. The Los Feliz Murder Mansion. Perched on a hill overlooking Los Angeles, the Los Feliz Murder Mansion is a grand Spanish revival home with a haunting past. Its beauty is undeniable. Stucco walls, arched windows, and a sprawling view of the city. But for more than half a century, no one has dared to call it home. What happened on December 6, 1959, turned the mansion into a place frozen in time. Its eerie silence, a chilling echo of the horrors that unfolded there. The story begins with Dr. Harold Perelson, a well-respected cardiologist with a seemingly perfect life. He lived in the mansion with his wife, Lillian, and their 3 children, Judy, 18, Joel, 13, and Debbie, 11. To outsiders, they appeared to be a model family, wealthy, accomplished, and living the American dream. But behind the facade, cracks were forming. Dr. Perelson was under immense pressure. Financial troubles loomed large. A failed medical invention had left him in debt, and his life seemed to be unraveling. Some who knew him whispered about a history of mental instability, though nothing concrete was ever documented. What drove him to the breaking point remains a mystery, but what he did that night shocked the nation. In the early hours of December 6, 1959, while his family slept, Dr. Perelson retrieved a ball-peen hammer. He entered the master bedroom and struck Lillian repeatedly in the head with the tool, killing her almost instantly. The brutal force of the attack left her lifeless on the bed, her blood soaking into the pristine white sheets. From there, he moved to his eldest daughter Judy's room. She awoke to the sight of her father standing over her, hammer in hand. He struck her once, but she managed to scream and fight back, waking her younger siblings. Judy's cries startled Dr. Perelson, and she managed to escape. Bloodied and terrified, she ran from the house, screaming for help. Joel and Debbie awoke to the chaos but were unharmed. Neighbors, alerted by Judy's cries, called the police. By the time officers arrived, the scene inside the mansion was one of utter carnage. Lillian lay dead in the master bedroom, and the children were huddled outside in fear. In the downstairs bathroom, Dr. Perelson was found slumped on the floor, a cocktail of Nembutal and 31 tranquilizers coursing through his veins. He had ended his life after the attack, leaving behind more questions than answers. The mansion, now tainted by its bloody history, sat vacant. A year after the murder-suicide, it was purchased by Emily and Julian Enriquez, who had no intention of living there. They used the home as a storage space, filling its rooms with furniture and belongings, but never spending a single night inside. After Julian and Emily passed away, their son Rudy Enriquez inherited the property in 1994. Like his parents, Rudy never lived in the house. Over the years, the mansion became an object of fascination for ghost hunters, trespassers, and urban explorers. Those who peered through its dusty windows reported seeing untouched furniture, Christmas decorations still in place, and even a 1950s-era television set. Everything eerily preserved, as if waiting for a family that would never return. Rudy Enriquez remained elusive about the property, refusing to sell it or renovate. When asked why he kept the house, he once shrugged and said, "Why go through the headache of getting rid of it?" The mansion became a macabre time capsule, its dark history cementing it as a local legend. Today, the Los Feliz murder mansion stands as a haunting reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the darkness that can fester behind even the most beautiful facades. The dust-covered rooms, the lingering memories of violence, and the eerie stillness make it one of Los Angeles's most infamous haunted locations. Number 1. Squatter Slaying. In 2015, a quiet East Los Angeles neighborhood became the site of a gruesome crime that shocked the community. The body of Cassandra Ochoa, just 21 years old, was discovered in the garage of a vacant home. Her life had been brutally taken with a hammer, a weapon wielded with devastating intent. The man accused of her murder was her transient boyfriend, Antonio Medina, a figure with a troubled past and a volatile relationship with Ochoa. Cassandra and Antonio had been struggling. Their lives were marked by instability, poverty, and a downward spiral that left them clinging to each other despite the turbulence. On the night of her murder, the couple had sought shelter in an abandoned, converted garage, a desperate attempt to find a place to stay for the night. Witnesses later reported hearing an argument between the couple. The shouting and tension escalated into violence, and by the time neighbors checked the scene, it was too late. Cassandra was found lying in a pool of blood, her injuries so severe that she was unrecognizable. A hammer, the tool of her murder, bore the evidence of the savage attack. Antonio Medina, 28, was immediately identified as the primary suspect. Witnesses had seen him fleeing the scene shortly after Cassandra was found unresponsive. Investigators quickly learned of Medina's troubled history. Recently released from prison for grand theft auto, Medina had a criminal record and a volatile temper. Friends of Cassandra revealed that their relationship had been fraught with violence, and Cassandra had expressed fear for her safety in the days leading up to her death. Among Cassandra's belongings, police found a journal entry that would haunt those who read it. Written just days before her murder, she had scrawled, "God, I need you now." The words spoke of her desperation and fear, a chilling forewarning of the tragedy that would soon unfold. A massive manhunt for Medina began. Authorities combed East Los Angeles and surrounding areas, looking for the fugitive. For Cassandra's family and friends, the days that followed were filled with anguish as they grappled with the senseless loss of a young woman whose life had been filled with so much potential, yet cut short by violence. The case became a stark reminder of the dangers faced by those living on the fringes of society. Poverty, unstable relationships, and untreated trauma had created a storm of circumstances that ultimately led to Cassandra's death. Thank you for joining us on this unsettling journey through 10 horrifying Hammer homicides. These tragic and shocking stories remind us of the fragile line between the ordinary and the unthinkable. If you found this video thought-provoking, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Creepshow. Let us know which story left you most disturbed or suggest other chilling topics you'd like us to uncover. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, sometimes the most ordinary things can hide the darkest intentions. See you in the next one.